So a couple winters ago, my HOA decided something pretty bold. They sent me a letter claiming they had revoked my mountain access easement. Yeah, revoked. Like it was a gym membership or something. And the funny part is they sent that letter without realizing one small detail. The only road their entire winter tourism business relied on crossed a piece of land that I actually owned outright. And right across that piece of land sat a steel gate. My gate. So I did what any calm, reasonable human being might do after being told their property rights had been revoked. I closed the gate. Just like that. Locked it. Hung a little sign. And then I sat back and watched the chaos unfold. Now, to understand why that little gate caused a full-blown meltdown, you have to picture where this place is. My cabin sits high up on a ridge above a development called Pine Hollow Ridge. Nice name. Very polished brochure. Lots of pictures of smiling people in snow gear and cozy fireplaces. You know the type. But when I bought my land years before that subdivision ever existed, the only thing up there was timber and an old logging road. Narrow gravel track winding up the mountain, cut decades earlier so trucks could haul out lumber. That road crossed several parcels, including the lower lots where the HOA neighborhood eventually got built. When I purchased my property, the deed included a recorded perpetual easement along that exact road, meaning legally, permanently, that road gave my land access to the outside world. No negotiations, no approvals, no HOA votes required. Just a simple recorded property right tied to the land itself. For years, everything worked fine. People built houses below me, families moved in, kids rode bikes up and down the gravel road. Sometimes they waved when I drove past. Nobody questioned anything. Then a few years later, the HOA board changed leadership, and suddenly Pine Hollow Ridge had a new vision. Turns out somebody on the board realized the mountain behind the neighborhood connected to a pretty large network of snowmobile trails. And suddenly the marketing language changed. Direct mountain access. Adventure rentals. Winter tourism gateway. The development started attracting investors who turned their cabins into short-term rentals. Snowmobile trailers started showing up on weekends. And guess what road they all had to use to get to the trail system? Yeah, that same narrow gravel road that ran past my property and climbed the ridge. At first I didn't really care. A few extra trucks on weekends, whatever. But then traffic doubled, then tripled. Heavy trailers grinding up the hill, spinning tires in wet gravel, carving ruts deep enough to swallow a shovel. The drainage ditch that used to handle spring runoff started failing because nobody maintained it. By late winter, the road looked like something out of a war documentary. And here's the thing that started bothering me. The easement document actually had a shared maintenance clause, meaning everyone benefiting from the road was supposed to help maintain it. So I did the reasonable thing. I emailed the HOA board. I sent photos of the ruts, the washouts, the drainage collapse. I said, hey, look, the traffic has increased because of your rental program. The easement requires shared maintenance. We need to fix this road before spring thaw turns it into a trench. You'd think that would be a simple conversation. Instead, a week later, I got a certified letter from the HOA. Not about road repairs. Not about maintenance. Nope. The letter said my access rights were subject to updated community covenants, and that continued use of the road required approval from the association board. I remember reading that sentence 3 times thinking, wait, what? Because the HOA didn't exist when that easement was recorded. Their rules came decades later. But apparently the new board had convinced themselves they could retroactively control access to a road that legally ran with my land. I sent a polite response attaching copies of the original deed and the recorded plat map highlighting the easement corridor. Simple explanation, this easement is perpetual and appurtenant, meaning it's tied to my property, not to HOA approval. I figured that would settle things. It didn't. About a week later, another letter showed up. Same letterhead, same board signature. And this time the wording was even better. They said my easement was revoked pending compliance review. Revoked. Like they had just canceled my parking pass or something. Now I'm not a lawyer, but I've owned land long enough to know a few basics. Easements recorded in property deeds don't just vanish because an HOA board votes on it during a Tuesday meeting. But they sent the letter anyway. And here's the part they clearly hadn't thought through. About a quarter-mile down that gravel road, right where the climb toward the ridge begins, there's a small strip of land, maybe 60 yards long, that belongs entirely to me. Not easement land, not shared access. My property. Years earlier during wildfire season, I installed a reinforced steel gate across that section to control vehicle access during dry months. It was one of those heavy ranch gates, thick steel tubing, concrete posts set deep. Normally, I kept it open because everyone used the road, and there was never a problem. But the HOA knew that gate was there, and they knew the only plowed winter route to the snowmobile trail network passed right through it. So when they sent that revocation letter, something clicked in my head. If my easement had been revoked, as they claimed, then technically the only traffic that still had a legal reason to go through that gate was me. My property still had access. Their tourism business did not. So I drove down the mountain one evening, brushed the snow off the hinge, swung that steel gate closed, slid the bolt through, snapped the lock. Then I posted a sign right next to it. Private property. Access restricted according to recorded easement terms. And then I went home. The next morning, the first rental guests showed up towing snowmobiles. They drove up the road, rounded the corner, and found a locked steel gate blocking the only route to the mountain trail system Pine Hollow Ridge had been advertising all winter. Within about 48 hours, the HOA board realized they had a very serious problem. All right, let's pause the story for a second, because this is where things get interesting from a legal and psychological standpoint. When people hear HOA, they usually imagine this all-powerful neighborhood authority that can regulate everything from paint colors to mailbox height. And honestly, in a lot of situations they do have broad control. But there's a very important boundary most HOA boards either forget or pretend doesn't exist. According to standard procedure, HOA rules only govern property that is subject to their covenants. They don't magically override recorded property rights that existed before the association was created. From a legal perspective, a perpetual easement appurtenant is one of those rights that runs with the land itself. Think of it like a permanent attachment to the property deed. It doesn't belong to a person, it belongs to the land. So when ownership changes hands, that right travels with the parcel automatically. An HOA can regulate shared amenities, neighborhood behavior, maybe even road usage within their community boundaries, but they can't just vote away a pre-existing recorded easement. That would be like your neighbors voting to remove your driveway because they don't like how often you use it. The law simply doesn't work that way. Now here's the psychological layer, and this part happens all the time with HOA boards. This is a psychological trap. Once a group gains authority over a community, especially if they start managing money or tourism or rental programs, they slowly begin to confuse administrative power with ownership. They manage something long enough that they start to feel like they own it. And when someone outside their control reminds them that they don't, the reaction is often denial. Instead of checking the legal documents, they double down. They issue warnings, send letters, escalate pressure. Because admitting they're wrong would mean admitting their authority has limits. And in my situation, the board had already built an entire winter tourism strategy around a road they technically didn't control, which meant acknowledging that easement wasn't just a legal inconvenience, it was a threat to their business model. So when they sent that revocation letter, what they were really doing wasn't enforcing law. They were bluffing. They were betting that I either didn't understand the property documents or wouldn't push back hard enough to challenge them. Unfortunately for them, the mountain road they needed happened to run through the one place where their bluff could be tested instantly. And that's exactly what that locked gate did. Now, the first 24 hours after I locked that gate were quiet, almost suspiciously quiet. A couple trucks drove up the gravel road, stopped, turned around, and headed back down the mountain. I figured word hadn't spread yet. But by the second day, the chaos started. Pine Hollow Ridge had been advertising those snowmobile trails all over rental websites. Glossy photos, drone shots of the mountain, captions promising direct access to miles of pristine winter riding. Except now, every guest towing a trailer hit the exact same surprise halfway up the climb, a steel gate, locked tight, with a sign that basically said access restricted according to the recorded easement terms. I heard about the first argument around noon that day. One of the rental guests called the property manager screaming because they had driven 3 hours, unloaded their machines, and now they couldn't reach the trail network they had booked the cabin for. By evening, the HOA board started receiving refund requests. Lots of them. The thing about tourism is momentum. Once a few bad reviews hit, the rest come fast. Guests started posting online saying the mountain access was blocked. Some people thought it was construction. Others assumed the trail system had closed. Nobody knew the real reason yet, but the rental owners inside the subdivision definitely felt it. Late that afternoon, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered. On the other end was a guy named Richard Collier, president of the Pine Hollow Ridge HOA. I'd met him once at a neighborhood meeting. Smooth voice, confident, the type who speaks slowly like every sentence is supposed to carry authority. "We've received reports that you've locked the access gate," he said. I told him yes, I had. There was a pause on the line, the kind where someone is deciding how aggressive they want to be. Then he said something I'll never forget. "That road serves the entire community. You can't just block it." I actually laughed a little when he said that, because the irony was perfect. A week earlier, they had sent me a letter claiming my easement was revoked. Now suddenly the road belonged to everyone again. I reminded him of that letter. There was another pause, longer this time. Then he switched tactics. "Look," he said, "we need that gate open for winter operations." Winter operations. That phrase told me everything I needed to know. The subdivision had turned mountain access into a revenue stream. Rentals, tours, equipment transport, and that little strip of land my gate sat on had become the choke point for the entire system. I told him something simple. If my easement had truly been revoked, like their letter claimed, then I had no obligation to allow unrestricted traffic across the portion of land I owned outright. Silence again. Then the conversation ended with a vague promise that the board would review the matter. Over the next 3 days, the pressure ramped up fast. Property managers started calling me directly. Rental hosts left messages asking if there had been a misunderstanding. One guy even drove up to my cabin and knocked on the door, trying to negotiate access for his guests. But the problem wasn't just the gate. The problem was documentation. That revocation letter had created a legal contradiction. According to the HOA, my access rights were suspended. But according to the deed recorded with the county, they weren't. And as long as that contradiction existed, the safest move for me legally was to treat the gate as a boundary control point on my private parcel. Eventually, the HOA board realized they couldn't bully the situation back into place. About a week after the gate closed, I received another certified envelope. This time, it wasn't just from the HOA. It came from their attorney. The letter said the board requested cooperation in reopening the gate while discussions about the easement continued. Cooperation. Interesting choice of words. Because a few days earlier they had claimed they could revoke my rights entirely. I forwarded the letter straight to my own lawyer. Now my attorney wasn't the dramatic courtroom type you see on TV. Quiet guy, very methodical. He read the documents, reviewed the recorded plat map, and then drafted a response that was about 3 paragraphs long. No insults, no threats, just facts. The letter said the association must formally rescind the revocation notice, acknowledge in writing that the easement was perpetual and appurtenant to my property, and enter into a cost-sharing road maintenance agreement consistent with the recorded easement terms. Until those conditions were satisfied, the gate would remain closed. When that response went out, things got very quiet again. Not because the problem had disappeared, actually the opposite. Winter tourism at Pine Hollow Ridge had reached peak season. Every weekend, new guests arrived expecting trail access. Every weekend, they discovered the same locked gate. Refund requests kept piling up. Rental owners started pressuring the HOA board because the marketing promises no longer matched reality. This is where the power dynamic flipped. Before the gate closed, the HOA board believed they controlled the situation. They wrote the rules, sent the letters, made the decisions. But once that steel gate locked, control shifted to the one thing they couldn't vote away, the land itself. And land doesn't negotiate with board meetings. About 3 weeks into the standoff, I got another call from Richard Collier. His voice sounded different this time, less polished, more tired. He asked if we could meet in person. We met at the base of the road, near the gate itself. Snow piled up along the edges, snowmobile tracks everywhere on the lower section where riders had tried, unsuccessfully, to find alternate routes. Richard stood there with 2 other board members and their attorney. He looked at the gate, then at the sign, then back at me. "This situation is hurting the community," he said. I told him the community created the situation when they tried to revoke a recorded property right. The lawyer stepped in then. Calm voice, very careful wording. He said the board was prepared to withdraw the revocation notice and acknowledge the easement as recorded. In exchange, they wanted assurance that the road would remain open for access to the trail network. I told them access had never been the issue. Maintenance had been. and the document already required shared responsibility. The conversation went back and forth for about half an hour. Eventually, they agreed to draft a formal road maintenance agreement. Cost sharing, scheduled repairs, drainage improvements. Everything the easement had implied, but nobody had bothered enforcing before. 2 weeks later, the paperwork arrived. Official letter rescinding the revocation. Recorded acknowledgement of the easement. Signed maintenance agreement filed with the county. Once those documents were finalized, I drove down the road again, brushed the snow off the hinge, and unlocked the gate. It swung open the same way it always had. Within hours, trailers started rolling up the mountain again. Snowmobiles buzzing past. Tourism resumed. But something had changed. The HOA board had learned a very expensive lesson about the difference between governing a neighborhood and owning the land beneath it. So after everything settled down, after the paperwork got recorded, the gate reopened, and the snowmobile trailers started climbing the ridge again, a lot of people asked me the same question. Why didn't I just open the gate earlier and sort things out later? Why let the situation escalate until the HOA was bleeding money from canceled bookings? And honestly, the answer is pretty simple. Because sometimes the only way people understand the limits of their authority is when reality forces them to see it. According to standard procedure, property rights in the U.S. are built on recorded documents, deeds, plats, easements, things that sit in a county archive long before any HOA board ever exists. Those documents are the foundation of land ownership. HOA rules are more like house rules layered on top. They matter, they can shape how communities function, but they don't rewrite the underlying legal structure of property. And that distinction is something a surprising number of HOA boards forget once they start managing budgets, amenities, and neighborhood politics. They get used to approving projects, enforcing fines, telling people what they can or can't do with their own homes. After a while, it creates the illusion that their authority is unlimited. But from a legal perspective, it isn't. From a legal perspective, the Pine Hollow Ridge situation was actually pretty straightforward. The easement granting access to my land was recorded long before the subdivision existed. That meant the HOA inherited the reality of that easement when the neighborhood was built around it. They could coordinate with it, maintain the road, even benefit from it, but they couldn't erase it with a vote. The moment the board tried to revoke that right, they crossed from governance into overreach. And the irony is they probably never would have tested that boundary if the road hadn't become valuable for tourism. Once money entered the equation, the psychological pressure changed. This is a psychological trap you see in a lot of organizations. When a group begins generating revenue from something, they start feeling entitled to control it, even if the legal foundation underneath it belongs to someone else. The HOA board wasn't just managing a neighborhood anymore. They were managing a business model built around winter recreation. Snowmobile access meant rental income, marketing credibility, property value increases. So when a legal document threatened that system, their instinct wasn't to reevaluate the plan. Their instinct was to try and overpower the obstacle. And here's the funny part. The obstacle was never actually the easement. The easement had existed peacefully for years. The obstacle was the assumption that nobody would push back. Because most homeowners faced with an HOA letter just comply. They assumed the board must know what it's doing. They assumed challenging it would require a lawsuit, or thousands of dollars in legal fees, or years of stress. And sometimes that's true. But sometimes the situation is much simpler. Sometimes the law is already written clearly enough that all it takes is refusing to accept an incorrect interpretation. The lesson here is that documents matter. Old boring documents with survey lines and legal descriptions, those things outlast personalities, board elections, and neighborhood politics. They define what can and cannot be done with land. And when those documents say something is perpetual, that word carries weight. Now, I'm not saying HOAs are evil. Some of them work well. They maintain roads, keep shared spaces clean, organize services that benefit everyone living there. But they function best when they remember what they actually are: administrative organizations created to manage a community, not sovereign governments that override property law. Once a board starts believing its authority extends beyond the documents that created it, conflict becomes almost inevitable. And that's exactly what happened on that mountain road. Pine Hollow Ridge tried to treat a permanent property right like it was a temporary privilege they could suspend whenever it became inconvenient. The locked gate was simply a reminder that reality doesn't operate on HOA meeting minutes. The interesting part is what happened after the agreement was signed. The road actually got better. Drainage repairs were installed, gravel resurfacing happened before spring thaw, and traffic was managed more responsibly during peak tourism weekends. In other words, the solution that existed from the beginning, shared maintenance under the easement, finally got implemented once the power struggle ended. Which makes you wonder how many conflicts like this could be avoided if people slowed down and read the original documents before trying to rewrite them. But I'll leave you with a question. Because situations like this happen all over the country, and everyone has a different opinion about how they should be handled. If you were in that position, if an HOA board tried to revoke a recorded property right tied to your land, would you have handled it the same way? Would you have closed the gate and forced the issue? Or would you have tried to negotiate first and avoid the confrontation altogether? I'm curious what you think, because the line between standing up for your property and escalating a neighborhood conflict can get blurry fast. And sometimes, that line runs straight across a quiet little mountain road with a steel gate sitting right in the middle of it.